Welcome back, everyone, and thank you so much for sticking by us and joining us in all the sessions for the Imagine Futures Conference hosted by the CSA&G and Just Leaders. We have now come to our last piece, our last session. It's definitely not the least, with Thiruna Naidoo. We really hope that you will enjoy the session. She'll be sharing on the work she does with the SOGIESC unit at the Center for Human Rights, and I'm just going to read her bio for you. Thiruna identifies as a multidisciplinary artist, author, and visual creative interested in the intersections of human rights, law, advocacy, and the arts. Specifically, she is keen on how these intersections relate to the rights of the LGBTIQ+ persons and other vulnerable groups such as migrants and peoples of the female gender. She is currently pursuing an LLM degree in multidisciplinary human rights at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. She has recently authored and edited a report on current practices in conversion therapy, emerging technology, and the protection of LGBTQ+ rights in Africa. She has contributed to a guide for African national human rights institutions for implementing resolutions 275 in Africa. She served as the co-project manager for the Queer Strategists for Change Leadership Program in 2017, hosted by our center at the University of Pretoria. Thiruna's most recent work as a creative or multidisciplinary artist has come in the form of a book of poetry, very lovely, I have a copy, and art, which she had self-published in the late 2018. Touch, an anthology curated by Tiffany and Kim. Thank you so much for wrapping things up for us, Thiruna. No pressure, you always do a great job, so welcome.
Okay, so can you all hear me? Okay, great. So for the first part of my presentation, I'm going to be relying on my little friend over here because I'm going to be discussing about kind of the context and the history as to how South Africa is now in the position we're in when it comes to LGBTIQ+ legal frameworks and how they originated. So I felt as if it would be appropriate to kind of contextualize our current position by reflecting on our history and how we got to this point. So I think as many do, we can start looking at the documented history from the dawn of colonization. I think Christianity as a pervasive system to regulate society played a very big role in shaping South African society as we know it today. So we can go as far back as the 1730s in seeing how the Christian-based education system developed with the arrival of German missionaries and ended only in 1953 when the Bantu education system was introduced. Other missionary schools, such as British missionary schools, were the primary source of education for South Africans. And through these schools, ideas around sexual purity originated and started to spread into South African society. Missionaries also had a cultural impact through the alteration of norms and people's perceptions towards sexuality and the shaping of a public morality. And they were able to dictate to their followers as to what could be considered as being good Christian values, what the public morality should be, and what has then created this legacy that we now live in today. Although we can look at the pre-existing situation, there is evidence of some forms of acceptance of homosexuality pre-colonial times. This has been documented in the practice of boy wives, which were taken in various parts of Africa, and especially in South Africa, it was practiced in the mining migrant workers who went off to the mines and were able to kind of have this accepted practice that still, in a sense, was shaped by patriarchal ideas, these Christian patriarchal ideas as to how people should be forming relationships and what you should have in your life. As a man, you should have a wife to take care of you, to look after your laundry, your household chores, and to make your life easier. And then if you move, hop, skip, jump forward, and when you kind of get to that era in the early 1900s, the Afrikaner nationalist movement, which then started to kind of concretize its idea as to the type of South Africa it wanted to create. They relied a lot on the Dutch reformist Calvinism, which became a major foundation for how they would construct this idea of apartheid and this nationalist identity. So to be a good South African citizen, to be a resident of the, I think at first it was the Union of South Africa, and then we transitioned to the Republic, you needed to kind of subscribe to this nationalist identity. And it was heavily informed by the Calvinistic tradition, which obviously viewed homosexuality as unnatural and immoral. And it was quite interesting because when we look at the history of the legislation that we have in South Africa, with the arrival of the British colonizers, they brought with them the English law, which criminalized unlawful carnal knowledge, which was seen to be having sex for fun, knowing like what it's like to have sex outside of the idea of procreation, and also having same-sex sexual activities taking place between men. That was frowned upon by the English and codified into law. And then as that law then kind of became bastardized when the apartheid government gained power, they, informed by their constant state of paranoia, they put in place many measures that were designed to kind of protect this purity, protect this sanctity of what the South African citizen should be. So they believed that South Africa was under siege from outside forces and internal forces as well, because they were trying to figure out how do we govern, this vast, sprawling state that had fragile relationships between these different territories that had been feuding for the last 200 years and finding ways to kind of solidify their identities into homeland states or former British territories. So they were very much informed by their Christian ideals, as well as that sense of paranoia as to how can we protect our state, how can we protect our good family life and our moral upbringing that we are designing for people. So they try to control a lot of aspects of society. So you can see, over the years, one of the notable acts that I think really characterizes their approach to governance was the Terrorism Act in 1967, where they started to really clamp down on forms of literature, films, anything that could be used to kind of conscientize people into other forms of thinking and self-expression. And their approach to clamping down on political movements that were working towards advancing the rights of historically marginalized persons, such as Black South African people, colored South African people, shows that, it's not just sexuality that they were really trying to control and regulate. They were trying to regulate as much of society as they possibly could, because they only wanted people to form part of a specific value system that looked a certain way, that acted a certain way. They were also very paranoid about the threat of communism, and especially Black consciousness and civil rights movements were seen as threats to the very survival of the South African state. So they began with this kind of conception around how people who were not of heteronormative sexualities would be perceived to threaten their society. As we know that there were queer people that were less documented and had to be like restrictive around their safety and stuff. But we do have like examples to see that there was a gay culture and gay life that existed, within the state. And people would form these places where they could meet, gather, interact with each other, and essentially find other people who are inclined in the same way you are. And if we look back at the history of the legislation, so the Immorality Act, which came into force in 1957, was one of the first pieces of legislation that tried to regulate relationships between people. And it prohibited sexual intercourse between people of different ethnicities. And this is because during the 1920s, Afrikaner nationalism was gaining momentum and was beginning to define the future of what the apartheid state would become. And what they believed was that it would require that strong foundation in having Afrikaans culture, Afrikaans language, and the Dutch Reformed Calvinistic Christianity being preserved and separated from the English influence and not being contaminated by what they perceived to be the dangers of various other races and ideologies from other systems that could threaten that foundation that they perceived to be, the success story for what the state could become. So this Immorality Act seemed to introduce the idea that, the government can now come into your bedroom and tell you what you can or cannot do with other people, whether it's a heterosexual pairing with a white man and a black woman, or a pairing of people of the same sex of any colors. And the specific phrasing that they used was they prohibited any unnatural or immoral sexual acts, which then goes back to that idea of what public morality was shaped to become through that system. And it was used as a euphemism for any sexual acts that were associated with homosexuality or non-reproductive intercourse. So they viewed it as anything that people were doing that was non-heteronormative, not reproductive, seemed to be challenging the idea of what public morality would be. And then amendments were introduced after there was a public raid on a weekend in 1966. 9 men who were at a house party were arrested, and some of them were arrested for masquerading as women. So if you would think of, in that time, the language for trans women, the language for people who cross-dress wasn't really available, and it hadn't been concretized. Those identities had not been concretized. And they were brought in for participating in indecent activity. And it was a very high-profile raid. It was captured in the newspapers. As you can imagine, if this is the type of environment that they've created or they've been trying to push, it must have been quite a scandal at that time. So because of that, they then introduced an amendment, and this amendment effectively made homosexuality illegal. So this legislation was specifically designed to prohibit sexual intimacy between men, which is what you often see in a lot of the colonial legacies that are still existing in states where they criminalize same-sex relationships. So the focus isn't on, as an individual, you are a criminal because you are queer in some way. It is because the act that they can catch you doing is what is perceived to be the illegal thing. That's the thing we'll make illegal. Because there wasn't that understanding that people have different ways of relating to each other, emotionally, mentally, physically. That's just a small part of what being an LGBTIQ plus person can be. Your sex life is just a very small, minor aspect of it, but that's the part that they can walk in on, see it happening, and have physical proof that, okay, we think this is a homosexual man. They're engaging in homosexual activities, you know. So this also was now the moment in history where the movement for LGBTIQ plus rights originated from. It was a gay rights movement, and homosexuals began to mobilize in order to combat this amendment, because effectively it was very problematic. So there was the law reform movement that was created in 1968, which was just really like a small group of working class gay men, white gay men, and brought people from different classes of society together in order to combat this amendment. And their objective was to maintain the status quo, to just allow that, like, okay, we won't have homosexual behavior in public spaces, but we'd like to continue with our private parties, with our private meetings, so that their way of life is not interrupted or hindered. And it distanced itself with the anti-apartheid movements of that time, because they wanted to still maintain some respectability in the eyes of the government. So they didn't want to be like, okay, we want to change everything. You know, we want to actually just make it easier for all gay people of all colors, you know, to have access to the freedoms to form relationships and not be interrupted by the state knocking on your bedroom door because they are looking for illegal activities. They were actually like, no. We just want to go back to how things were before the raids. You know, we just want our life to be fine and uninterrupted. And like that also kind of speaks to the way movements emerge and develop. At that point in time, here's your first real political action as a movement. And the choices they made were to distance themselves from other movements that they could have played an ally role to. So this separation of homosexual rights along racial lines is just an example of just how far-reaching the evils of apartheid was. I mean, if you do think about it, there were instances where there would be multiracial gatherings of queer people. There would be people who had interracial relationships with people of the same sex. But because of the pressures and the concerns that they had of that time, they were like, the only action what are we going to give up for what we want? You know, I think that was the question that they were left with, which doesn't condone, you know, what they did at that time, but I'm just trying to explore like the different aspects of what the thinking could have been. So eventually they were successful. The amendment did not pass in the way it was initially designed, but there were a few changes, which is, number one, they increased the age of consent from 16 to 19. Dildos were outlawed, very interesting, and they introduced this clause of there cannot be men at a party, right? Which meant that more than two men cannot be together and perform any form of sexual act that would arouse sexual passion. So this men at a party clause specifically says they cannot perform any act that would arouse sexual passion. So even if you think about it, like, okay, let's not think about it, let's move on, because that's another thing. But the objective of the government was to try and minimize the presence of homosexuals and to protect society from that corrupting influence. However, LGBT communities that were already existing at that time were relatively unaffected, except for the random sporadic raids and sensationalist stories in the media. And I think things really got to continue for a while after that, at least, you know. But then when you get to the 70s and the 80s, across Africa, you now have that independence wave of different African states fighting for liberation from, you know, the colonial powers that were still overseeing, their governance and stuff. So in South Africa as well, the political atmosphere was also changing, and LGBT rights groups began to incorporate the LGBT struggle into the wider anti-apartheid movement. And this led to the formation of an organization. One of them is the Gays and Lesbians of the Witwatersrand, which was Simon Nkole's organization, which specifically focused on marginalized groups, historically marginalized groups, and queer people within those groups, to provide support and to create a unified front to battle both homophobia as well as apartheid, because there was an understanding that this state that is subjecting all of us to oppression is the problem. It's not that, we can deal with the homophobia separately to the racial oppression. They're both intertwined because they both relate to that original conception of how identity should be formulated. So if I just kind of skip fast ahead, you can see that now that we had started aligning with anti-apartheid groups, they had a major impact on homosexual life in cities. Now that you have started creating that visibility, it then creates the opportunity for advocacy initiatives that are targeted towards, finding out what are queer people's issues, how can we better service queer communities in these spaces. And usually in that type of moment within a political movement, activists begin to emerge, which was the case. And then alongside this, in 1982, the HIV Aids epidemic then became very prevalent, and the gay community was disproportionately hit. And a lot of that is around the education and the access that the community had at that point to sexual and reproductive health services. It was very limited. It was very skewed towards heteronormative ideas around family planning, and it didn't kind of make room for, the situations that involved intimacy in a same-sex context, or intimacy that had to be shielded and kind of kept secretive. There was a lot of lack of information, I think, that ended up leading to that problem, but that's not something I think I can speak to with any expertise, so I will leave questions on that to Pierre and maybe Rebecca. But yeah, so as well, during that time in the 1980s, they did try to bite back as well and try to find other ways to try and control people and still influence people towards heteronormative ideas around identity. And, some of the atrocities that I think have not been documented enough are how white male men were still being sent to be a part of the army, and in the army space, if they were identified to be queer in any way whatsoever, they could be subject to different forms of conversion practices, such as electric shock therapy, imprisonment, public humiliation, beatings, and what we know about this is very limited, because I think a lot of people have not spoken out about what has happened to them in that time. But there is a little bit of information about it. And then when we move into the early 90s, where the political tensions have gotten to that point where F.W. de Klerk and his people had no choice. They had to decide how are we going to transition out of this point, So Mandela got released from prison, and then this kind of inter-organizational collaboration began towards exploring what would a free South Africa look like. So there were negotiations around the 1993 interim constitution, which was still designed as an act and was passed as an act while they prepared for elections. And then when they had the 1996 final constitution, they then decided to explicitly include that there's an equality section, which is Section 9 of the Constitution, and Section 9.3 specifically speaks about the grounds on which a person cannot be discriminated. And they say that no person shall be unfairly discriminated on one or more of the following grounds, and some of the grounds included are like race, gender, sex, and they included sexual orientation, which then is kind of like the best weapon you can have for an LGBTI movement, because now there is constitutional recognition for the protection of this group, this historically marginalized group. And over the next 15 years or so, the LGBTI movement in South Africa was able to begin strategic litigation to take down a lot of the laws that were discriminating actively against LGBTI people. And they started with repealing the criminalization of sodomy, then moving on to kind of getting that recognition for domestic partnerships, access to life insurance benefits, access to, if I am a lesbian woman and I have a partner and I have a child that's my own, can my partner get parental responsibilities over the child that we both live with together that doesn't have another parent? So they began in that way, and all the way up until 2006, when they then created the Civil Union Act, which created an alternative system for people to form unions that look like marriage but are not called marriage. Because, again, they had the option, the Constitutional Court identified that it was discriminatory for the Marriage Act to specifically state that when you get married, the process, you have to say a specific sentence, right? And the marriage official has to declare the two people who have married, like man and wife. A man has married a wife, a woman has married a husband. Man and wife, husband and wife. No, man and woman, husband and wife. Those are the words that were very important in the act. And it was deemed to be discriminatory. But Parliament then proposed an alternative system that looks like marriage, isn't marriage, but people can still access the same rights and protections that are designed under the institution of marriage in South Africa. And although we have had many advances in legislation, we have a vast legal framework. I mean, we allow for the alteration of sex description, we allow for adoption, we allow for artificial insemination for the same-sex couple to have all of the rights. There's still many limitations, and that exists out of the designing legislation without thinking about what would the long-term impact be. So let's say, for example, with the Alteration of Sex Description Act, which that's not the full name, it has a longer name, but when people then began to obtain legal recognition for their transgender status, if they were already married, their marriage would then become null and void because they would be issued a new identity number, of which part of your ID number contains 3 numbers that relate to your gender. So now there's no legal record of your new identity being married to your same partner that you live with. So there were many issues that were created, and there are many blind spots within this legal framework that are being amended, that are being fixed, that are being dealt with today. And I must commend, South African civil society really has, over the years, done a lot of work around sensitization and trying to figure out what are these gaps in the legislation. And we are at a point today where there are very few pieces of legislation that are needed. One of the big ones is the prevention and combating of hate crimes in South Africa, hate crimes and hate speech. Which is a very contentious act. We all recognize the impact of hate crimes on the LGBTI community. I mean, 2021 itself, we've seen a surge in violence against the community, resulting in the deaths of many LGBTIQ plus persons. And while we have this extensive legal framework, what has it been doing to protect people? Has the law really socialized people to acceptance But when you look at the evidence, when you look at how LGBTI people explain that they are being treated today, how they still feel invisible in institutions, and the surge of violence, it makes you wonder that, can a legal framework really reach into society and change things, change people's way of thinking, And I think that the challenges faced by LGBT communities is that although you have government protections, there hasn't been effective implementation of these legislative frameworks that have been designed to protect LGBTI people. And one of my big contentions is that if you look at some of the Constitutional Court judgments and the things that have been said in them regarding LGBTI rights, the way that the judges can articulate ideas around family life, love, intimacy for LGBTI people, what human dignity would be like, are so profound and really give an insight as to what we'd like the future to be. But in reality, how far do those judgments go in changing people's lived realities? It's very difficult to find ways for that to then reach into societies where there is still lots of resistance, where you can't even show your face as a queer person, and I think that there are many issues, and although there have been legal and social advances, it's still common for LGBTIQ+ people to experience exclusion, to experience discrimination, both on an interpersonal and institutional basis, which I think, a lot of this conference that we're in, a lot of the presentations have made us explore, the tensions between interpersonal discrimination and stigma versus institutional discriminations and stigma. And when I think about it, one of the examples I have in my mind are that when we think about the homophobic rapes that are perpetrated against lesbian women, predominantly black lesbian women in South Africa, if you were a lesbian woman who is in a wheelchair, how would you report that? How would you go to a police station that doesn't have a ramp to report that you've been raped by people, and it was also on the basis of your sexual orientation and the way you identify? So I think there are a lot of complications, and I think that we're at a point where we shouldn't just be commending the state for implementing these laws. We should actually be challenging the state and asking, what are your laws worth? What do you do to implement them? Do you feel like having, this protection in the Constitution has made LGBTI life visible in a negative way? Has it made the community vulnerable in specific ways? I think I will take questions. Actually, I will hand over to Naledi because she's been inching closer to me. But I hope we've all learned something. And I think that I come at it with a very specific viewpoint, but there's a lot we can discuss and unpack in relation to this.
Thank you so much, Thiruna. And what I've come to realize today, and sure some of us realize, is that history does play a role in how we continue the work that we do. Rebecca earlier spoke about how pandemics aren't new. We've actually been living in a variety of pandemics, and living in December at the moment, we've been hearing people mention that we're a bit icky in terms of prioritizing COVID as if it's the only pandemic. There's HIV. We've also have GBV in South Africa and abroad. So thank you so much for that historical lesson and sharing some of the approaches you use at the unit at UP. So right now, you're actually correct. We're going to take some questions. We currently don't have any questions online. If we have some questions in the room, please raise your hand rather, and I can bring the microphone your side. And while people are deciding, I was just thinking about how policy also came up a lot, but also the very affective, I think that's the word. So the emotions, the shame, embarrassment, the pleasure and healing that comes with the different topics we spoke about. Dildos came up a lot, and we definitely understood that we need to be challenging our state, we need to be challenging policy, and I'll link it back to the Just Leaders program. We then need to take everything that we learn about and try to disseminate it, because it's all good and well to have communities and spaces like this where we're able to share this information as privileged people. Remember, we mentioned how we might be in university, I might be a poor student, but in a sense, you are privileged compared to the other people who might not have been able to come into university spaces. So another important part is the dissemination of this knowledge beyond the spaces that we're in. And as mentioned before, we will be sharing these on social media at the beginning of next year. So any other questions? If not, we'll definitely be fielding questions online as well. We actually do have 2 questions at the top. Please give me a moment, I'll get to you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Thiruna, for that presentation. I learned quite a lot, and it's quite a lot to think about as well. I just wanted to focus on the first historic kind of discussion you gave about the church and how the church created this concept of sexual purity and how consequently that policed the way people kind of think about sexuality today. And I think we've seen a bit of a change in the church, because there's a lot of churches these days that are beginning to embrace or at least discuss sexuality. And there's definitely a change, I think, in the way a lot of Christians, practicing, devout Christians as well, are seeing sexuality. And I think it's something that's not often spoken of as much, but if you have any comments around that, considering that there was a history where the church was very much against homosexuality, and now we're seeing a movement amongst a variety of different Christian movements that support and promoting sexual diversity. That was just my question.
Okay.
Yay, working. I'm not sure if I have a question or more of a comment, but I think as you were going through the history of everything, what I find interesting is that sort of reluctance in giving power to people. As in, we've already done A, B, and C that was wrong, so we'll amend that, but no dildos. Or we'll amend that, but because there's a semantic of saying husband and wife, we'll give you some rights, but we can't call it marriage. Always like, we're definitely doing something, and then the follow-up conversation always becomes, is there really such a thing as structural violence? Is there really discrimination in insert here? I think something Rebecca even showed earlier is one of the oldest pieces of script is a conspiracy theorist trying to say these kids these days, and it's just funny how it keeps repeating, and people go, well, we've given you this, so there is nothing more to complain about. But clearly, even in giving those things, you very clearly made sure there's like a tiny little element left out to just sort of remind you that we're not exactly equal. So sort of as a very weird question is, in then going forward, how do we sort of look towards these things where we realize that we have made progress, we have done a lot of things but there's still these tiny missing elements that people will say, well, we've fixed this problem, we've ended the situation, but clearly there are still a lot of things that appear to be very intentionally there to remind certain people that they're not exactly the equals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think to start off with, is it Martin? Okay, Martin's question. I would say that, we are seeing shifts in different Christian belief systems, like sub-belief systems. I'm not a Christian myself, so please excuse, I might conflate certain ideas and stuff. But that specific church, the Dutch Reformed Church, still exists today. And they're also very slowly, very, very, very slowly, not coming around, I'd say, but I mean, like, a lot of the court battles between members of the church and the church have kind of shown that they are still reluctant to really explore varying ideas around sexuality. One that comes to mind is there was an equality court matter between a person who was a pianist at the church, or an organist, yeah, and their duty was just to play the organ and to actually teach children different aspects of music, So they were employed, they had a contract with the church, and they were then subsequently found to be gay and in a homosexual relationship, and they were fired because of this, because they couldn't accept having a gay employee, even though in the case, what ended up transpiring was that they were found to have unfairly discriminated against the individual because he was not a member of the church. He didn't personally subscribe to the belief system that they had, and he wasn't involved in the education around religious matters. He wasn't, part of that religious structure. So we do still see resistance, and I feel like especially in Africa, a lot of the challenges we now have is that while the state created this environment where homophobia can persist, churches or religious institutions have taken up the mantle to really enforce, this sense of public morality, So I would say there's still a lot of reluctance, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done around degendering religion. Like, can you be a person who just believes in God and it doesn't matter what you are doing with your body, because that's my own personal belief. And then with Chris's question, I think that the answer would really be looking at what substantive equality can provide in those situations where, although some form of concession has been made, I think it's of my personal belief that even if it is a very, very minor, small group of people who will continue to experience a lack of access due to the way the infrastructure was created, you have to create mechanisms which provide access for that group as well. And we do see that there is now a shift, particularly with the example I used of the Civil Union Act. Last year, or the year before, last year, there was the Civil Union Amendment Act. So with the original Civil Union Act, it created the civil union system, and it also had in one of the sections that if you are a marriage official and you don't personally, because of your own belief system, believe in homosexual relationships, you don't have to perform that marriage. And that was in 2006. And from 2006 to about 2018, you can imagine that there were many same-sex couples going to Home Affairs offices, applying for the solemnization of their union and to get that legal recognition for their union, and struggling because there wouldn't be an officer in that department's office that is willing to solemnize that union. And it then becomes an institutional issue, which they struggle to solve within the department. They put out a notice saying that people should try to accommodate these same-sex couples that come forward. If no one in your office will do it, arrange for someone from another office to come in on a specific day when they have their appointment to do it. And that also didn't work. So then eventually the Amendment Act was passed, which then nullified that section of the Act, which was, it's a decent interim remedy. But the ideal situation is having one homogeneous marriage legislation that looks at all the different legal recognitions of marriage in our country. Because while we have the Marriage Act only applies to heterosexual marriages between one man and one woman. And then we had the recognition of customary marriages that came in the late 90s, which then looked at plural marriage systems where you could be one man who may have multiple spouses, and then we had the Civil Union Act, and then people who are followers of the Islamic faith had challenges, especially with around getting their divorces, because there was that lack of recognition. And even today, Hindus don't have any form of legal recognition for their marriages. So whenever a Hindu person gets married, I went to a Hindu wedding earlier this year, you have your wedding, your priest is there, everything goes down around the fire like it should, and then you have already booked an official who has come in and is charging you a certain amount of money to then give you the contract so that you can sign your contract and you enter into an anti-nuptial agreement, because your religious ceremony is not recognized by the state, but other people's religious ceremonies are. So there's a lot of discrimination in the way marriage legislation has come up. And there is a white paper, I think, on it, and there will be one act that will exist for everyone soon. And it's going to be very interesting to see how they have defined the concept and what they allow for in it. But yeah, so I think that's time. Oh, there's more questions. Oh, great, yay.
Hi. So at the end, you spoke on, which I loved, you mentioned that we are at a point where we shouldn't just commend the government on changing the laws and making them better, but we should question what they're doing to implement them. So at this point in time, considering the fact that we have people in power who we cannot trust, so what can be done to implement those laws and make them more effective for people in the LGBTQI+, people who are living with disabilities, and women as well?
That's actually a really great question. So at this point in time, there is a national task team that was formulated to deal with the issue of, it started off looking at those homophobic rapes of lesbian women, but then it widened to the ending forms of violence against LGBTIQ+ persons. And that task team is a collaborative engagement between many civil society organizations who are doing a bulk of the labor in identifying issues, providing support, providing training, even to department officials. And then what is meant to be happening is that the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development is the founding or the secretariat, they hold the secretariat for the NTT. So they convene the meetings, they call everyone, they send out invitations to other government departments who are also meant to be present, because they may have programs that they are designing or implementing that are related to or that include LGBTIQ+ people in their scope. So the Department of Women and Children would be there, the Department of Social Development, the Department of Home Affairs. There would be representatives from different Chapter 9 institutions, so like your Commission for Gender Equality, your South African Human Rights Commission, as well as other institutions such as the South African Police Services. And they have made some headway in trying to kind of organize how we can monitor and track hate crimes against LGBTIQ+ persons. But because there isn't that formal legislation, it's difficult to disseminate information around, the tracking that has been done. And even the way the tracking is being done, I think is still very much on an informal basis and based on the partnerships that people are coming forward in good faith and working with the state to do. I do think that is a very important collaborative space that can make a lot of change, and hopefully it will continue to work. There's a new national intervention strategy that is meant to come out soon that will explore how the entity can function as well as to better resource it, because a lot of the problems is that programs aimed at LGBTIQ+ persons are not resourced by the state. So the state needs to figure out how to do its resource allocation and fundraising where needed. Because a lot of civil society organizations, our funding is coming in from Europe. We're not self-generating, we're not self-sustaining, and that also controls how programs are developed and implemented according to what the funder decides the focus should be on, or what the funder feels the focus area should look at. But there's a lot of political issues, and I will say that, when we do compare South Africa to other SADC states, we are doing something, not the best, but something. So I think, as activists, you have to build on the infrastructure you currently have available to you, and then from there, see what can be done. Okay, but yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Thiruna. Thank you so much. Let's give Thiruna a round of applause. Sorry. Am I now in the right spot, everyone? Thanks very much. Thank you. And we had one last comment from Belinda that I just wanted to make in this collective. Sorry, everyone. Am I audible and understandable? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Belinda wanted to make a comment there, which I'm just going to try and fold into the session on what I think is almost a South African cliche at this point, which is to talk about the beauty of the laws and the hardness of their implementation. Belinda's question was on the issue of enactment and of pushing from having beautiful laws to having their perfect enactment. And I was just thinking, based on the last question, and kind of reflecting on where we are politically and just, I suppose, philosophically as well, that this is a time in which we recall the rape and the murder of that University of Cape Town student, Oyinene, and I think at a really amazing, politically fascinating event in South Africa's kind of negotiated transition, when Graça Machel spoke at the University of Cape Town at the event of Oyinene's memorial service, the last two words that she said to the audience were "take responsibility." So that was very, very confronting and difficult. And I think today what we've had is an absolutely remarkable day of wonderful discussion on some of the most kind of socially contentious, politically contentious, pandemically contentious points of discussion and debate, and that's something which the Centre for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender really prides itself upon. So thank you everyone for being part of that and part of a critical discussion. I think if the Centre is anything, it is critical, and maybe if it's anything next, it is political. But let me maybe try end on a high note, just to say thank you so much to our organisers from today. They haven't been thanked properly, and I would like to start the thanking and continue the thanking for the rest of the conference, and also in the precious interstices that we have of those wonderful human engagements. Thank you so much, everyone, for making it possible to have some personal human engagements. Thank you, everyone, for attending. For those who are online, greetings. Greetings from in-person reality here. And just to say thank you so much to Holisani Korombi for being the head of this astonishing program, the Just Leaders program. And I think what's fascinating is that we've taken a really ambitious topic here. We're in the midst of a pandemic and we're talking about imagining the future, what that looks like. So thank you so much to our Just Leaders program. Thank you to Naledi and Panza for the elegant, gracious, beautiful helping to chair and to move with such aplomb around the room. And thank you everyone. Thank you our speakers and the audience members. And what's going to happen next is Naledi will tell you.
Right. Thank you so much, Rebecca. That is all. And please note that this was recorded and will be available on social media. We'll communicate in the new year. Goodbye, everyone.